Hi everyone, it's Lori. Today's video is an update all about intentional camera movement photography. So I have a video that covers the basics of ICM, and I did this video a couple years back. I wanted to do an update for you, an update on learnings that I've had, some different images, some different techniques as I've grown in my practice of shooting with intentional camera movement. So let's jump in and get started together. I'm calling this review of images and information for you what lies beneath, because as I think about ICM photography, I think it is what is underneath the layers that we see with our eye, but what's underneath when we use our camera. How do the colors come together, the textures, sometimes different colors or light or patterns. And so when I think about intentional camera movement photography, I really think about how it's expressing what's underneath. And so I hope you will consider that as you're exploring ICM photography. Now, if you are a beginner to this style, I will put in the description below another video that I have where I go into much more detail about getting started. All right, so again, ICM photography is a way to create an image in a very abstract or impressionistic way. It adds just some creativity and flair. Again, it lets us showcase what's underneath the surface. In using a slow shutter speed, you introduce blur or movement to the image. Now, this process still requires composition. Other rules of photography still apply, like your light, color, your editing, but this just gives you a lot of freedom to create something in a really abstract, interesting way. Now, I know off the bat it is not for everyone, but there's a huge group of people that love this type of photography, and I would encourage you to give it a try in the new year. It is just so freeing and so fun, and it's really interesting what you're able to capture. So these are some new images that I took this year using ICM photography, all different styles, different places, and I'll go through some of these as we work together. Now, one of my key components of ICM, and it's a little different than most photographers, is I believe you can use it anytime, anywhere, with any lens, and without filters. And that's kind of my mantra. I love to incorporate it. I don't go out necessarily to shoot ICM, but I may be on a nature hike and decide to use it as I'm shooting. And so I hope as you learn a little bit more about this style of photography that you also will be able to incorporate it as you're out shooting. So again, we talked about that this style of process of photography is really about letting go. It's exploring. It's seeing what do you see with your eye that you want to capture in a creative way. A couple ways I think about it is I look for leading lines. I look for something that's upright, like trees, something blowing in the wind. And sometimes it's not fun to go out and shoot when it's windy, but if you use ICM, it's a lot of fun. So camera movement is where it all starts. Now, when I first got started, these are some original images. I found it best to go in the direction. So if you think about tree branches, moving the camera in the direction really makes it easier. As you get more experienced, you can try different types of movement. Now, larger movements or faster movements are going to give you different results. So when you get started, try moving in really grand, large, where you're moving almost your whole body. Try moving the camera just a tiny bit. Sometimes I call it a jiggle. You can also do really fast jerks with your camera or really slow. So everything works, nothing's off the table. So here's some styles that I really like. Again, panning is moving the camera left to right. That's an easy one to get started with. It works great if you're out at a pond, a river, the ocean. You can tilt vertical, so move the camera in short bursts up or down. That can really work with trees and just give you that little bit of burst. Now, once you get more experience, there are options like circular, wavy. You can use your lens to create a zoom look, and you can also tilt. If you have a filter on where you have a long shutter speed, you can tilt and then even do a spot focus. So those are a little more advanced and fun, but worth mentioning. So here's some examples of a wide variety. So you can see in the upper left, that is going to be ocean movement. So I'm actually moving it in a panning fashion. So moving it across. Now I think for this one, I went across to the left because I wanted these waves as they're coming in. This is again some water where I would have done it in kind of left to right and just a little bit of that upward movement. These were some type of fern or cactus in a greenhouse, and I just shot them moving the camera down at an angle. So just making sweeps with the camera. Now these would have been very fast movements and very short. So think about just moving the camera down in a very fast, short way. Same thing with the grasses in the bottom left. And then this center image is one that you'll see in some other examples where I like to do kind of a jiggle. So I just take the camera, if you hold it to your eye, you just want to jiggle it where you kind of feel it. If you hold it out using your viewfinder, then you can just jiggle it. You can jiggle to the right or left, or you can jiggle it front to back. So you're just kind of shaking the camera, and it will give this impressionistic look. It's one of my favorite techniques. So everybody always wants to know settings. And really, this is where I keep it simple. You definitely want a low ISO number. You want your ISO down as low as possible. And your aperture setting can be anywhere from f11 to f32. You want to adjust based on your light, but typically you want it as high as you can go. f16 to f22 is kind of the sweet spot. However, if it is darker or you're in the shade, you could lower your aperture number. Now, filters are great options. So they work great if you're shooting in bright light, or if you are new to ICM, you may want to throw on an ND, a neutral density filter. A 2 to 4 stop works great. That's just going to cut the light and allow you to work with a slower shutter speed to really control your movement. After you get a little more experience with ICM, you won't have to use your filters as often because you can really manage your movement and your shutter speed. You can start at 1/50th of a second and go up all the way to a half a second or 1 to 2 seconds. It's totally up to you, and play with your shutter speed as you make your movements. Now, often your images will look a little overexposed, and that's okay. You can always adjust them in post-processing. This was a dahlia in my garden shot during the day, and I just did some quick downward movements to get that beautiful soft look of it blowing in the wind. This is a large image of the ocean. This was not a panoramic, but it was a complete panning at sunset, and I really love this image. All right, so a couple tips for you before we dive into some image case studies. You have to be patient. This process is not going to be a one and done. This is a process where you have to shoot a lot of images. You're going to want to take 10, 20 or more in one spot to get one that you like. I typically do it very fast. So I am just pressing the shutter, moving, and then doing it again. And I'll do it in different movements, different speeds, to then look at them when I get home to see what I like. The final image really depends on the movement, the speed, and the smoothness of your movement. So you want to continue your movement throughout the exposure. So if you're using a long exposure, 1 second or greater, you want to keep moving your camera through the entire process. You can start the movement and then press the shutter if needed. So if you start at the bottom and kind of press your shutter and then start moving, that can help if you're getting started. Don't delete images until you get home. You may really be surprised by how they look once they're out of your camera. And just don't give up. You have to kind of keep trying until you get the hang of it. Once you get one you like, I promise you're going to be hooked. So when you go to editing, you often need to work on your exposure first. You may need to bring down your highlights or whites. The second tip is I almost always add contrast. Contrast is going to bring out some details and definition to that kind of blurry image. And then the third tip is you have to check for dust spots. You're going to see dust spots, water spots, anything that's on your sensor, it's going to show up. So you could have a lot of cleanup, which has happened to me before. All right, so let's go through some examples, and then I want to jump into Lightroom and I'll show you a couple more images. So these are from this year, and this is an example on a spring day. I was out actually leading a workshop, and we were hanging out in this garden area. There were these huge yellow flowers blooming, and this lady was standing having her picture taken, and I thought it was a perfect opportunity to flip my camera really quick. So I dropped my ISO, I raised my aperture, and I started capturing with small movements. And I originally did some fast movements and I was getting her too blurry. So I did just some really quick bursts of movement in a really short way. I did not have on a filter, and so I was at 30 millimeters away and my shutter speed was at 1/30th of a second. This did require a little bit of editing, but it really wasn't too overexposed. So I think because maybe the way I was facing the light, but I really love this image. I printed it on some beautiful archival kind of rag type paper, and it's really gorgeous. So this was in the garden. I love to explore with macro ICM. I think it is the most challenging, so I will warn you, I haven't quite mastered it yet. But in the garden, I recommend using really small movements, and I do think an ND filter helps if it's really bright and sunny. So this was done actually with a Lens Baby lens that I had on, so you're not going to see the aperture setting. But I would have moved the aperture up, and the ISO was still at 400. I was out shooting in the garden and I just didn't change it. So it's a great example that you really can do ICM anywhere, anytime, and I'll show you another image from this collection in a minute. So this was another one out in a spring garden, and this is where I did the jiggle method. So I hold my camera out, I have my viewfinder live, and I just jiggle the camera a little as I'm shooting to get this impressionistic look. This was at f/16, ISO 200, and only 1/5 of a second. So, this is more of that impressionistic, almost a multiple exposure look, but I'm doing it by jiggling the camera. I love this winter scene. Now this just has a little bit of movement, not a whole lot. It was only at 1/17th of a second, and it was daylight but cloudy. And I just panned up just a tiny bit to kind of streak all of this, but I was still able to keep the structure of the image. So you can do just tiny movements if you want to keep things a little more visible to the naked eye, but yet I was able to get this nice blur in the background. So water is a great place to start if you are new to ICM, because you can pan in any direction, and this gives you an example of all different speeds. So doing a really slow movement and long can give you these long lines, something kind of in between, and then something with just a little bit of quick movement. So it's fun to go out somewhere if you have a river, a lake, a pond, anywhere where you can play with water. It's going to really help you figure out how ICM works and get some really pretty images. And this is one of my favorites from fall this year. So this was using that jiggle method and a little bit jiggle and some panning up. So kind of jiggle and move it up at the same time so that I could get all this gorgeous texture in the trees. Okay, so let's jump into Lightroom. And and I thought I'd go through some more of my favorite images from this year using ICM. So this was a spring tree. These are some of my absolute favorite to work with. And let me just make this bigger for you. Yeah, these are some of my absolute favorites because they are so fun to do movement with. So I think for this one, this was that jiggle technique again. You could also just do a tiny bit of movement. I like the jiggling the camera because it allows you to keep the trunks of trees kind of holistic, but jiggle the movement of the branches. Now this was at 1/45th of a second, ISO 200, and again, this was with the Lens Baby lens. So I don't have the aperture, but I would have turned it up probably to at least f16. Now, if you live near a garden center or a arboretum or a greenhouse area that has winter plants, succulents, agaves, ferns can make a great subject. So I love to go in the winter to our local botanic garden and just play. So this would have been with just a little bit of movement at f18, 1/7 of a second, no filter. You can see there was some light. But again, I was out shooting without using ICM, decided I wanted to try it. This was in March of this year, and I just did a little bit of movement over to the right. So just some slow movement to create this image. I already showed you that one. All right, so this was a cherry tree, and you can see it's a little bright. It would have been great if I did have a filter for this one. I think it would have been even more stunning. But I just loved the effect of if the wind was blowing and the tree just kind of dancing over into the water. This was at 1/40th of a second, f14, ISO 160. And then here is that dahlia flower. And I've done a couple of these. This was one where I was able to get the background. I shot this one on a white background, and it was just standing in a vase, and I was trying to see if it helped me get more of the detail in the flower. And I just love how ICM helps you just express the flower in a different way. So this was again with a Lens Baby lens, so I don't have the aperture. It was 1/8 of a second, ISO 500. This would have been with the Lens Baby Velvet, and that's an 85mm lens. And I probably would have been at f14 for that. And then this is the one that I was showing earlier. And again, I was out in the garden and I really quickly just flipped my aperture and decided to try it with some ICM. And for this, I would have moved my camera down to get these streaks of the petal. So just a little bit. I also do some winter trees. I think trees are just so fun to use ICM to get that cold winter look and to just show all the textures in the trees. And just really, I like to have fun with those. I think it's a great way to express the season of winter. And I think it just gives a great emotive, beautiful image. So that's all for today. I will again put the link to my longer ICM video in the description, but I just wanted to give you an update on my journey of ICM. I think my key learnings have been to just continue playing with the different techniques, using it in more spaces. So I've been using it in garden scenes, with flowers, and just continuing to explore. I think for next year, I am going to try doing some in bright areas and actually using some filters. So I'll give you an update on that as next year comes along. But I want to thank you for joining me on this ICM journey. Let me know in the comments how much you enjoy ICM, what your favorite type of ICM photography is. I'd love to learn from you as well. Thanks so much, everyone.